Hi, I'm Phil Lowe. This is the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is the art of woodworking. In this episode, what I'd like to show you is some, talk about some chisels and the different types of chisels that we use when we're doing different types of woodworking processes. And also, I'm going to show you how to do mortise and tenon joints in this episode as well. Let's talk about some mortise, some different types of chisels to begin with. If you look at the bench here, what you'll notice is that I have an array of different chisels. They're, different types of chisels for different purposes. And these three chisels that we have here are what they call firmer chisels. And the way that we determine those is by the square edge, and they're relatively wide, and they have about a 25-degree bevel on them. Now, this is really what they call a framing chisel. It's a lot more stout. It has a leather washer in here. It has also what they call a tang, which is a sort of a sharpened point that goes into the handle, but you'll also notice that the handle has this ring on the end. So if I want to do really aggressive cuts, it'll prevent the handle from splitting. Okay, a couple other chisels that we have here are what they call bench chisels, and you'll notice that these bench chisels have these bevels on them, and these are designed so that you can get into really tight places. In case you have an angle, like on a dovetail or something like that, you can work right up against the really sharp corner. And all these chisels, what you'll see is different ways in which they attach the handles as well. The handles on these firmer chisels are what they call tang, attachments, and these are what they call socket attachments here, where the handle actually goes into a conical shape opening in the end of the chisel itself. Then we also have a real refined chisel that you see here, which is actually a paring chisel, and this is one that I actually made out of an old jointer knife and put a handle on. And this one here we don't use with any type of mallet or hammer or anything like that. It's all done strictly by hand. And then we have these three chisels here. Actually these four chisels. These are really interesting chisels. These are some antique mortising chisels, and as you can see, these are really designed to do some really, aggressive work. The handles on them are really big and heavy, and I particularly like this one because of all the facets that are on it. You can actually see that this was hand shaped with a plane and so forth. But again, these are tang chisels, so that it has this bolster or this rounded area, so that when you drive with a mallet, that's going to actually, transfer the work down into what you're really trying to chop. And these three particular ones have three different sizes. We have a 3/8 inch wide one, a 1/4 inch wide one, or 5/16, and then an 1/8 inch wide one. So depending on the size of the mortise that we want to cut, will really depend on the one that we choose. Now, this is a contemporary mortising chisel that is made by Lee Nielsen. As you can see, it's a little not quite as stout as the others, but it does the work just as well. One of the other things that you'll also notice is the way that these are sharpened. They don't really have a huge hollow grind like you see on this one. It's much more straight or curved type of bevel that's put on it. And the very end of it is really the only thing that gets sharpened. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about mortise and tenon joints. And a mortise and tenon is basically an opening that's chopped or into a leg, like this cabriole leg here. And then you have a tenon that fits into that mortise, that like you see here. And This is a way that they used to join, pieces and parts together. And it's a really important joint in furniture making because it's used so exclusively to, actually join two parts together. Okay, I'm going to just show you a little drawing about a mortise and tenon joint. And if you look closely here, what we have is an orthographic projection, which means that we have a front view, a plan view, and a right end view. So we're looking at the mortise and tenon from the end of this. You'll notice that I have a bare-faced tenon, which means that the tenon comes directly off of the bottom of this the board that it's attached to. And then we have a couple other terms that we would like you to know about, which is the tenon cheeks, which is the two sides, the wide sides of the tenon. And then we have the tenon shoulders, which are the parts that actually butt up against the leg. Then we have the stile and the rail, and that would be for a door of some sort. Well, what I'd like to do now is just to show you how I'd go about laying out a mortise and tenon. I have a sample here that I'll use, and well, let's just talk a little bit about where mortise and tenons are actually used. If we look at this table down here, this table was constructed with mortise and tenon joints as well. So, the side rail going into the two legs has a mortise and tenon joint on it. And then these dividers here and here have what we call a twin tenon. So I have a couple examples of those. And you'll notice that, we have just a basic tenon here, which has the three shoulders. It's bare-faced on the bottom. So we have the tenon with the three shoulders on here. We have the mortise here. And then we can also have what they call a twin tenon, which is a tenon, two tenons that are actually side by side, if you can see that. And that actually is designed so that when the rail is put into position, that it doesn't twist. We have also a decorative mortise and tenon here, which is used in a lot of Chinese style furniture, which is the mortise and tenon with a mitered shoulder. And then we can also have some unusual tenons where if you look at this one, it actually has an angle to the rail, so when the mortise is actually cut, you can see that it has an angle on it. So what I have here is this sample of this chair, and I'm going to take it apart so that you can actually see how it's put together. The back has been glued up on this, but if you look, I can take off the crest rail, which has a couple of mortise and tenons here, and for the splat. The splat is actually mortise and tenoned into the back rail with this stub tenon on either end. And then if I take the rails and the stretches out, you'll notice that each one of these has an angled tenon on it as well as a twisted tenon, which is one of the difficulties in chair making. The front rail is mortise and tenoned into here. You can see the four mortises that go into the legs for the stretches and the side rails. And then we have the side rails that go into these mortises in the back. And the interesting things about these is that they actually are twisted and angled in order to fit into the mortises of the back post. So, this is a completely joined chair, and this is really the best type of construction that you can find on any type of furniture. So what I'd like to do now is show you how to lay out a mortise and tenon. I have what I would call a leg for a table of some sort, and then I also have a rail. And what I want to do is to try to get this piece to fit inside of this piece over here. And to do that, I'm going to start off by trying to chop out the mortise, but I have to do a layout first. And the layout lines are really the most important thing here, because if I can lay out the lines really accurately and cut to those lines, you know, the joint is going to fit perfectly. So to start off with, what I'll do is I'll take the rail size and I'll put it up against the top of the leg and align it, and then take a knife and make a small knife cut across here, and then take a square and transfer that to the other side here. So this is where the mortise is actually going to stop on the bottom. Then I'm going to go ahead and take a marking gauge, and I'm going to set it for a 1-inch mark. So I'll actually take and set it at 1 inch. And I'm just going to put a little mark right here. And then I'm going to take the square and I'm going to work my way around this blank. Now you notice that I have a line here and a little, so this is my flat surface, this is my square edge. Now one thing I'd like to show you is that we need to wrap a shoulder line around here, and when we wrap the shoulder line, we have to keep the head of the square only on 2 surfaces. We want it on this one surface and one edge. And if we do that, we'll be able to make sure that the lines that we wrap around will meet up almost every time. And this is a pretty good example of how I can demonstrate that. If you'll take a look at this, this board here, you'll notice that I have planed quite a curve into the edge of it. And with that curve in the edge of it, if I actually start laying out a line, which might be a shoulder line off of this curved edge, and I put a pencil line across here, and then I go to the other side, and I keep working my way around, you're going to notice that what happens on this edge here, you can see that the lines don't match up. Now, if I only use this angle, or this curved surface for with the head of my square against it, and I only use one surface to lay it out off of with the broad surface, I put a line across there, and then again, if I use that curved surface and bring my pencil line across like so, and then across this side, you're going to notice that the line actually matches up. So that shows you that if you use a reference edge and one reference surface, you can still get the lines to line up, all right? All right, so let's try and apply that to this. So I have 2 lines. I always mark my material with lines that are the square corner and a flat surface. So the head of my square is only going to go against this edge and against that surface. So since I put that 1-inch mark here, I'll take my knife, and one of the things that you'll want to notice is that I have a single beveled knife, and it's flat on one side and has the bevel on the other. And the way that I hold the knife when I actually cut the shoulder line, when I bring that knife across, since this is the flat surface, that's a perpendicular cut, and the angle is to the waist side, which is going to get cut away. So I'm going to go ahead and snug that up right against there. Now I'm going to make sure I put the head of my square against this flat surface and bring that line across like so. And then again, I'm going to make sure the head of the square goes against the reference edge and across this way. And then again, the head of the square goes against the reference face. And I'll have a nice line that matches up all the way around. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take my marking gauge. This is where I'm actually going to lay out where the mortise is located and also the tenon is located. And when we do that, we also only work off of one surface. And we work from the outside to the first wall of the mortise, and then set it up and lay it out to the second wall of the mortise. And what I mean by that is I take the marking gauge and I'll choose a dimension. The dimension doesn't really matter that much. Let's see, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scribe a line from the end of the board down to my scribe line. But with this same setting now, with the same setting, I'm actually going to lay out the first set of lines for the tenon as well. So if I line these up now with the outside edge against the leg, you'll notice that the line, those two lines are exactly in the same spot. And you know, that's really important to make the fit of the tenon. Now I'll go ahead and do a second line, which now I usually like to make the mortise, if I'm chopping mortises by hand, I like to make the mortise a little bit wider than what my mortise chisel is going to be, so that I can come back and straighten the walls of the mortise. So the second mark will go on here. Again, I'm working off of the same outside surface and the same outside surface of the for the tenon. I'm going to run this back. Now, a good dimension to sort of keep in mind is that if you make the tenon 1/3 the thickness of the material, that's approximately the thickness of the tenon that you would like to have. And you also want to be careful to make sure that the wall of the mortise isn't necessarily too close to the outside of the leg, because if it gets racked at all, it can have a tendency to break. All right, so one last line that we have to put in here for the mortise is we don't want the mortise to come right out through the top of the leg. So if we come down approximately a 1/2 inch, I'll just measure this down a 1/2 inch here and put a mark there. I'm going to bring my line across like this. Now, one thing that you'll notice, and a lot of woodworkers do this, is they will scribe this line with a marking gauge off of the end of the board. And that isn't necessarily a good practice to employ, because if you happen to have an angle on the end of a board like you see here, if I ran my marking gauge along that angled edge, I would end up with an angled shoulder, and if I cut to those lines, what will happen is the leg will actually go together and be at an angle like you see here. And unless we're trying to put a splay on the leg, then we don't want that to happen. If we want a line that's going to be, perpendicular to a straight edge, which will bring the leg, right down square and perpendicular to the floor. Okay, so these are all laid out now, so I'm going to go ahead and show you how I chop the mortise. I'm going to go over to the corner of the bench here. All right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and chop a mortise, and we have to hold this piece down to the bench top as firmly as possible. And the way that I do that is I like to use a clamp, and I love these Jorgensen style clamps because they hold really well. A lot of people have a little bit of difficulty using them, but if you grab the clamp the same way every time, and personally what I do is I put this handle in this upper handle in my right hand. If I rotate this in one direction, you can see that the clamp actually is closing up, and if I rotate it in the other direction, it's opening it up, and it's also parallel. So what I want to do is I want to open this up to get it close to the dimension that I need, and then I'm going to bring this over the bench, and I'm going to go ahead and snug that up. And I always tighten it with the back piece here, and I want to make sure that these jaws are perfectly parallel. If they happen to be pinching, the clamp will move really quite easily, or if they're pinching in the other direction, it's not going to hold the part snugly. So what I need to do is make sure that that's perfectly parallel. And then I tighten it down, a little moisture on my hand, get an extra quarter turn out of it. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this mortise chisel, and I'm going to begin by chopping approximately 1/8 of an inch or so away from the scribe line that I made. And the other thing that I do when I chop these mortises is I always stand, in this position here, so that I can see how vertical the chisel is. It doesn't really matter too much if the chisel is angled in this direction to begin with, because I'm away from the scribe line, but it is necessary to be square when I'm looking at it from this direction, because otherwise, when I go to fit the mortise, the tenon into the mortise, it'll come off at an angle. So I'll go ahead and try to center the chisel. You notice that I have the flat towards the scribe line, and if I'm a little bit close to the scribe line, I can do what you call walk the chisel. So if I tilt it and twist it in my hand like so, I can actually move it along to wherever I need it to be without really lifting it up, and it makes it a little easier to get it in place. Now I'm going to stand back and make my first chop, and then I'm going to spin the chisel around, and when I make my chop this way, what you're going to notice is it pushes the material that's on the bevel side in that direction. It's actually splitting it along the side walls. And if you give it a little push in one direction towards the part that you chopped, it'll actually help to relieve the chip. And we'll just keep going until we get close to the end. Oop. And I'm going to come to within about 1/8 of an inch on this end as well. And the reason for that is I need to sort of lever this material out of here now, and if I don't do that, I'm going to bruise, the edge if I go right up to the line. Get rid of most of this. Then we'll do the same thing over again, but we can be a little bit more aggressive now because we have to, be able to go down about 1 inch. So give that a good whack, push it, and that'll free up some of that material that I'm chopping. You notice that I'm not being too gentle here, just trying to get that work done quickly. Now, if I need to, I can take my square and I can measure the depth by pushing this down inside of the opening, and that tells me that I'm about halfway there. So we'll just continue. Oop. Okay, we're getting close. See how far we made it on that one. We're probably we've got about another 1/8 of an inch or so to go. All right, this should take care of it. Okay, that's right at about 1 inch, so that's where we need to be. Now, what I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and change the position of this so you can see a little bit better what I'm doing. I need to chop to the lines at the ends of the mortise now. And what I mean by that is I need to go ahead and put my chisel right in the scribe line. Now you notice also that I am chopping, and I'm able to look at the, this edge of the chisel to see that that's perfectly perpendicular to my work. And we'll just chop down this way. And we do the other side. And we'll try to clean that out now without really marring up the ends if we can help it. Okay, I'm going to go back into the other position now. And I'm going to take a chisel. Maybe if you might be able to see me better if I work at it this direction. I'm going to grab a wide chisel now, and if you have one that's relatively long, you can also tell whether you're cutting perpendicular or not. So what I'm going to do now is put this chisel right in the scribe lines that I did with the marking gauge, and I want to go ahead and make a cut straight down on the sides. And this will square it off nicely. Now we got to be careful not to. We certainly don't want that, that mortise to be going in on this direction or on that direction. We want it perfectly perpendicular, to the surface. Clean that out. You want to make sure you close your eyes when you blow the material out of there. Now, a couple of last checks that I make here is that when I put this square up against the edge, if I can see a little bit of a space there, that indicates to me that this wall is really, on an angle in this direction, and it would hold the square away. So I would have to come back and clean that corner out. And I want to do it on this end as well. And I don't know if you can quite see that, but we got a little here. Let me turn this so you can actually see it. You notice that I have this space right here, so that means that this is the end of this is touching down low, and I need to get inside there and clean that out. So go ahead down inside here. One more check. Okay, one more time. Sometimes you can just use hand pressure at this point. And then I got to make sure I work right over into the corners as well, since the chisel is just slightly smaller than the opening now. Leaves a couple of cuts on either side. So that's what I need to do as far as the mortise is concerned. Now there's one other check that I do here. So if I take a 6-inch ruler and I put this down inside of the mortise here, what this is going to show you is that whether the sides of the mortise are perfectly square or not. So if I hold this up against the side of the mortise and I sight it along this way, I can see that it's actually tilted over ever so slightly, so that means that that wall is on a slight angle. So I'm going to come back and take a little bit more from just the bottom inside here. Clean out that material. And go ahead and check that again. That looks pretty good. I'll check the other side. And I'm thinking that that's a little bit angled as well. Okay, so mortise is done. Now we're going to go ahead and fit the tenon to the mortise. And what we have to do is we have to cut away the waste on either side, and we'll do that with a rip back saw. So I have two saws here. I have a rip saw that I can cut down along the side of the cheeks with, and then I have a cross-cut back saw that I can cut the shoulders with. So we'll start off with the shoulder cuts. And what I'm going to do is hold this in the vise here, and I'm going to have it up high enough that I can still see my scribe lines. I'm going to take my crosscut saw, stay a 1/16 of an inch away from the line, and just go ahead and cut down until I just touch the scribe line on both sides. We'll flip that over and do it again. And that gives us our two shoulder cuts that you see here. Now I'm going to hold this upright in the vise, and what you're going to notice is that I'm not holding the piece in the vise this way, because if I tighten this up in the vise and I have to start to make my cut, if it isn't holding it snug enough, the piece is going to move in this direction. So if I hold it in the vise with the edges facing towards me and towards that they face the jaws of the vise, I can come down this way, and that's going to hold it good and solid. Now, when I instruct people how to do this, sometimes what I suggest is that if you can make a saw cut from this corner down to this corner, and then the same on the opposite side, excuse me, same on the opposite side, I can then spin it around and then come in from the opposite direction. Now again, I'm going to stay slightly away from the line so I can eventually work to the line with a chisel or a shoulder plane. So I'm going to leave myself about a 30-second here, and I'm going to try to cut nice and straight up and down. And I'll cut the opposite side as well. Got a little fat on that side, but we have to clean it up anyway. We'll spin that around, come in from the opposite direction. Now, since I made two angle cuts, what's going to happen is I made a cut from this corner to that corner, and then he made a cut from this corner to that corner. So basically I have this little triangle that I have to come back and cut down to the shoulder, and when I do that, the part should just fall off. And then we'll do the other side here. Okay, so that's created the rough tenon for us. You'll notice that. Now, if you look really closely at this mortise and tenon and the lines that we have on here, you'll notice that I've left the scribe lines all around on the edges, on the ends, and on the opposite edge. Now, those are really important lines to have because those are lines that I need to work to. Because if I chop to the lines on the mortise, and if I can work to these lines on the tenon, the piece should fit perfectly, just absolutely perfectly. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go onto the bench, and I'm going to show you two ways that I usually take care of a shoulder. And what I mean by taking care of a shoulder is I have this scribe line here right now, and I have to cut to that line because that's the line that's going to actually make the distance between two parts. For instance, if when I have a chair leg and I need to have the legs a certain distance apart, that's what really makes the dimension that I'm after. So again, I'm going to hold this down to the bench, and I always want to make sure that the part is over the bench and not hanging over the bench, because if I chop too hard here, I could actually break off the tenon. So I want to make sure that that is on top of the bench. And I'll hold this in place, and again I'm going to stand to the side. Since I have the scribe line here, if I put my chisel in the line in this direction, and I can be looking at it from this spot here, I want to make sure that that's perfectly perpendicular. I can just come down like so. And the other thing is it's really important that we had this scribe line, because I can put that chisel right in that scribe line and it won't move at all. And that's what's really going to make this joint fit. And we'll get rid of a little bit of that material there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from the position on the bench over to the vise here, and I'm going to hold the piece perpendicular in the vise, and I'm going to take my paring chisel. This has about a 15-degree angle on it, so it's a lot steeper and it creates a much sharper edge. But when I go to cut to the shoulder, what I'm able to do is to take and put the chisel right against the material, and as I drag it up, it just drops into that line, and I'm able to just make a cut in this direction. And then once I have that established, then I just come along and only take about 1/8 of an inch cut from the side with each cut. And we work right along here. And cut that off and then trim that up a little bit. So that'll give us a nice shoulder. Now, the thing that we really have to be conscious of is to make sure that that shoulder is at right angles or square in this direction. If it's not square and it's angling up in this direction, when I go to actually assemble the piece into the mortise, there'll be a space along the very edge. So it's really important to make that cut perfectly square. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and try and I'll show you two ways that I generally will clean up these cheeks. I can do it one with a wide chisel, where I take and put the chisel right in the scribe line here and make sure the edge is above the shoulder, and I just sort of rock my way through till I get about halfway. Then I turn it around and come in from the other direction. Get that chisel right in the scribe line. And I can see the scribe line on the end of the board, so that's what I'm really concentrating on. And then I need to make a cut across this way to make those parts fall away, and then come back and true it up a little bit. Okay, I'm going to use what we call the shoulder plane. Now if I hold the piece in the vise and so that it's above the bench top. This shoulder plane has to be adjusted extremely accurately. If I happen to set it up and the edge of the blade is sticking out slightly more on one side than it is the other, it's going to put an angle into the mortise or into the tenon. And if I have, if it's angled towards the shoulder, it's going to make sort of a dovetail shape. If it's angled towards the outer end of the tenon, it's going to make a tapering shape. So when I set this up, I look at the projection of the blade to make sure that it's sticking out evenly all the way across, so that when I make my cuts going across this way, I want to make sure that I'm not putting any angle into it. A little bit more blade. This is a little bit more controlled. And you notice that I'm very deliberate, that I come up and make the, engage the cut and then follow through. And as I progress, what I do now is I look at the line. The line is good and parallel, and I want to look at it on the end. It's a little thinner here than it is at this end, so that indicates to me that that tenon is slightly angled in this direction, so it's thicker here than it is here. So I'm going to concentrate my efforts now right in this area. So I'll just make partial cuts going across. Now, if you look closely here, when I get close to my line, you'll notice that this is starting to flake away. You can actually see, where the scribe line was made here. And I've taken it away at this end, and it's still a little thick here, so that indicates to me that it's actually flaring out a bit. So I'm going to focus my work right on the very end here with a couple of thin cuts. Now, this is really a good trick. When we go to fit this into the mortise, it's going to fit into the mortise this way, because this was my reference edge, which has this little swirl on it. But if I take the part and I spin it around like so and hold that up against my mortise, I can actually tell, if we look here, you can actually see, I can still tell that there's just a little bit of the mortise sticking out. So what that indicates to me is that the distance from this outside surface to the cheek is not quite deep enough. So if I go back to my vise and take a little bit more material from this end over here, I should be in pretty good shape. And again, I'm going to spin this around. It's lining up with the mortise now. You notice when I rub my finger there, I can see that it's nice and parallel. So I want to try and fit it now until it goes into the opening this way. And that actually fits pretty good. All right, so the last thing that we have to do is to cut a shoulder into this that allows for what we left on the top of the leg. So I'm going to take a pencil and I'm going to hold this up against the mortise. I'm going to put a little line here, and then I'm going to take my square, and if I put that against the shoulder line, I should be coming off of there perpendicular, and that'll be the cut that I need to make. So I'm going to make my rip cut first. Vertical, and I'm going to go right along that line. And then I'll go ahead and make my cross cut. And I'm going to leave a 1/16 of an inch away from the scribe line. Now, you'll notice that I have this little projection where I didn't cut quite up to the line, so I need to put this upright in my vise again, and then take my paring chisel, put it right in the scribe line, and scribe across this way here, making sure that's perfectly parallel. Now I want to make sure that the corners of the tenon are cleaned really well. And then I'm also going to take my shoulder plane and I'm going to bevel the top of the tenon. And what that does is when I go to assemble this, it'll actually, the bevel will make it funnel into the opening. And clean up the end a little bit. And this should just hopefully just fit in there nicely now. All right, so you'll notice that it isn't quite seating, so there must be something inside of the mortise, which I think is probably the case. Oh yeah, I can see it down inside there. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get down inside there with my mortise chisel. Oh yeah, big old piece down in the corner there that I missed. There we go. Look at that. That's beautiful. Okay. So what we want to do now is, this is how all these mortise and tenons would have been put together. So. Now, if you have a little bit of a problem, I think I got a little bit of a shoulder that's not quite seated correctly. So I'm going to just rescribe this shoulder ever so slightly and recut it, and that'll allow me to have a good flat surface, because I noticed that there's a little difference in the height of these shoulders. So just to rescribe this ever so slightly. If you're making a table or something like this, you would have to do it to the opposite parts as well. A lot of times when I chop when I'm on the bench, I find that some of the edges crush a little bit. So this is I prefer actually paring the shoulder with a chisel like this. And come back this way. Know what this is? They call that industrial art. Yeah. All right, then we'll flip this around and we'll create a little more industrial art here. Coming in from the other direction. Come in from the end. Make sure that's cleaned well. Let's see how it fits. That's much better. I'm happier with that. All right. So the other thing that I'd like to show you before we finish up here is, in the old days, they didn't have any kind of clamps or anything in order to hold these things together. So what they did was a process by which they call draw boring. And what that means is I drill a hole through the mortise, and then I assemble the tenon into the mortise, and I mark where the hole is, and then offset it ever so slightly, so that when I drive a wooden nail or a pin in there, it'll actually pull it snugly and hold it together. So let me get out a couple of tools here so that I can go ahead and drill that hole. First of all, I'm going to find the center mark, and I'm going to come in. I want to be in about 1/4 of an inch off the shoulder, so I'm going to go ahead and make a mark here about 1/4 of an inch in. And I want the edge of the hole to be at that 1/4 inch mark. So I'm going to revert to a cordless drill here just to make things a little simpler. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and drill that hole so that the hole is right alongside of the 1/4 inch mark that I made. So I have a drill set up here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and drill all the way through here. And sometimes what I like to do is I like to at least put a piece of wood in the back here so it doesn't split out too much when I'm drilling through this. So I'll go ahead and get the drill. I'm using a nice little brad point drill here, and I'm going to drill it all the way through to the other side. Okay, now you can see there's a hole that goes all the way through that. Now I'm going to go ahead and assemble my mortise and tenon, and I'm going to use this brad point bit, and I'm going to go ahead and mark where the center of that is. Now, when I mark that center, which you can see here, you can see that that's the center right there. Now, if you think about this, if I drill the hole right in the same place, you know, it'll just basically go through. But if I offset the hole slightly like this, what happens is I have the wall of the hole that's going through the tenon is slightly closer to the shoulder, so that when I drive the pin in, it'll push against the side of that hole and draw the whole thing together, we hope. Let's give it a try. So I'm going to offset this hole now ever so slightly by about 1/16 of an inch or so. And now, let's see if we can see what's going on in here. Now, I don't know if you can see inside of here or not, but you can actually should be able to see that part of the hole on the tenon is slightly closer to the shoulder. Okay. Now we have to go ahead and make a pin. So you want to choose a nice hard piece of hardwood of some sort. I have a piece of ash on the bench over here. And I need to make a 1/4 inch pin. So I'm going to go ahead and set my marking gauge to 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to make a couple of lines. I'm going to try to choose a nice straight grained area. So this is has some nice straight grain on it. So I'm going to go ahead and make a line in this direction. And then again, another one in this direction. And I'll go ahead and cut those. I'm going to need a little bit bigger saw to do that. So let me grab that. I'm going to put the lines on the top, though, so I can see what I'm doing. Well, let me grab a little bit wider saw. So what I have here is a tenon saw, and a tenon saw tends to be a little bit wider than a dovetail saw. I was able to cut the tenon with the dovetail saw because I was only going 1 inch or so. I'm going to need to have a little bit more material for this, this pin, so I'm going to use something a little bit wider. So I'm going to go ahead and cut down along the side here at 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to go ahead and spin this and cut this from the opposite direction now. Then we'll cut this off of here with a cross-cut saw. And that's going to give me my 1/4-inch pin. Now, you'll notice that the pin, I haven't quite gotten to the line there, so I need to put this in the vise and plane to the 1/4-inch mark. So I'll go ahead and try to grab that like so. Grab my plane. Get down to my line. Pretty close, a little bit more on this end. Well, if you're having trouble holding it, another way to do this is to flip the plane upside down. And push the piece across. Okay, and then we'll get rid of the saw marks on this side. Now I'm going to go ahead and leave this square because I'm going to put a square pin into a round hole. Now, one of the things that we have to be conscious of is we need to taper the end of the pin. And we want to taper it in a way that it favors one side of the pin itself. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of turn this into an octagon, whittle it down. And then I'm going to heavily whittle it on one side so that I can get the pin beyond that offset hold that's in the tenon. That's why we make the pin extra long as well. Now you'll notice that this is favoring one side. So it's heavy on, the taper is heavy on one side, so that when I put this into the opening here, it's going to miss the offset of the hole. Now, when we go to drive this in, we want to use a hammer, a good heavy hammer, and we want to make sure, I think I got to taper that a little bit more. One of the problems that you can have is if you drive this pin in, it can hit the other side of the hole, and it would hit the end of the pin and stop it from going all the way through. And if that happens, sometimes the pin will break off inside of the hole, and you have to drill it out, and it just makes it a little bit more difficult. So that's looking pretty good now. Now, when I go to drive this pin home, I want to put it over a hole on the bench, make sure it's sitting good and flat, and then we just drive that right through like so. And, I mean, you can't get anything much stronger than that. It's unbelievable. And usually on some of the older pieces of furniture that you find, they leave the pin sticking out like this. They don't use any glue. You can knock that out, take the piece of furniture apart. So, and then another little decorative element that they might put onto the top would be a little pyramid here. And that would accent the pin. And if you burnish it a little bit with another piece of wood, make it look like it's 200 years old. So that's what we have now. If we needed to, we can certainly plane off the top of the rail to meet the top of the leg, just by passing a plane across here. And there we have it, one mortise and tenon. Thanks for being with me. I'm Phil Lowe at the Furniture Institute of Massachusetts, and this is The Art of Woodworking.